Fiona Hill, Mr. Putin, operative in the Kremlin. Dive into the intricate mind of Vladimir Putin as you explore the book summary of I, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, by Fiona Hill. Gain insight into the life and beliefs of Putin that shaped his worldview and his approach to leadership. Delve into the 6 overlapping identities that guide his decisions: the statist, the history man, the survivalist, the outsider, the free marketeer, and the case officer. Understand the significance of Putin's Russian idea and discover how he uses his background and vast understanding of history to create his unique governing style and influence international affairs.
Putin's multifaceted persona. Vladimir Putin's governing style, both foreign and domestic, stems from the combination of 6 personas, influenced by Russia's history, culture, and Putin's personal experiences. Western leaders must first understand this complex and multilayered man to decide how to respond to him. Putinism includes a more authoritative centralized state apparatus and a greater assertiveness in foreign policy. Putin's vision for Russia. Upon taking office, Putin sought to restore law and order to a disorganized Russian government. He implemented the concept of paradishka, or allowing Russia to focus on its own affairs. His Millennium Message served as his political mission statement, outlining his conservative philosophy, the Russian idea, which highlighted Russian values of stability, patriotism, and the necessity of political and economic reform. Putin intended for the state to regain its central role in regulating and steering society. Putin's use of history for power. Putin's adept manipulation of Russian history legitimizes his authoritarian rule and promotes a return to past greatness. Putin's fascination with Russian history and his manipulation of it has contributed to his reign as a neo-Tsarist leader. By drawing on the country's past, Putin justifies his authoritarian style of governance and promotes a return to Russia's glory days. He sees historical figures as role models and gathers insight from memoirs to learn from the successes and failures of his predecessors. Putin's aim is to create a strong centralized state, and he emphasizes the need for Russians to prepare for the worst due to their collective experience as a survivalist population. He emphasizes Russia's proud history as a strong, independent state that has always diverged from Western democracies. Putin employs this parallel between the past and present to forge and legitimize a system of governance known as Putinism. Putin sees capitalism as not about production and marketing but more about personal connections with regulators. Putin's image as a modern reformer is a product of his carefully crafted historical narrative. Inspired by former Russian autocrats who sought state unity and emphasized major state reforms through non-revolutionary means, Putin has cultivated an image of being a leader who can bring Russia back to its previous glories. Putin's manipulation of history and its integration into current policies has enabled him to maintain his power by promoting a return to the past. Putin's survivalist mentality. Putin's family's survivalist mentality, formed during the Nazi blockade of Leningrad, has significantly influenced his political worldview. As Putin seeks to build up and protect Russia's strategic material and financial reserves, he brings worst-case scenario thinking to policy planning and political calculations. When he arrived in Moscow in 1996, few in Russia's elite circles had illusions about the depth of the state's domestic crisis. This fascinating insight into Putin's background sheds light on his approach to governance and leadership in Russia today. Putin's anti-establishment persona. Putin's meteoric rise to power in the Kremlin was facilitated by his ingenious cultivation of a populist, anti-establishment image, which set him apart from Moscow's political elite. Putin and his PR team masterfully projected a tough guy persona that resonated with ordinary Russians and garnered him electoral success. His outsider status has worked to his advantage, making his short ascent to the top of the national political establishment all the more remarkable. Putin's pragmatic economics. Putin's market-based economic policies for Russia were shaped by his personal experiences in St. Petersburg, where he saw that exploiting vulnerabilities was more important to succeed than providing goods and services competitively. As the deputy mayor during the post-Soviet era, Putin learned to assess what worked and adjusted his approach without ideological biases. He believed that the state's interests didn't revolve around advocating for economic liberalism, but rather fiscal discipline and macroeconomic policies to protect the Russian state. Putin's psychological warfare. Putin's success in politics and leadership can be attributed to his mastery in manipulation and exploitation of his opponent's vulnerabilities. As a former KGB officer, Putin learned how to recruit and run agents, as well as collect information and use it as a weapon. He has since applied these skills in the political arena, studying the psychology of his opponents to understand their weaknesses and using them to his strategic advantage. This has enabled him to remain at the helm of power in Russia for decades. Putin's governing style. Putin's worldview is influenced by his background in the KGB, which informs his centralized approach to governance. He perceives himself as the CEO of Russia Incorporated, with oligarchs serving as operational managers who must implement his corporate vision. Putin's management style restricts delegation, centralizes decision-making, and consolidates power under his leadership. In Putin's view, Russia must be more aggressive and smarter than its opponents in the face of new challenges. While the oligarchs gain leverage through Putin's protection, their power is ultimately subservient to Putin's centralized command. Putin's multifaceted face. Putin's identity is multifaceted, drawing from various roles to protect Russia's interests. He deploys his skills as an intelligence operative to recruit assets, manipulate information, and crush opponents. He merges his case officer persona with the free marketeer to craft business deals and exploit his opponent's financial vulnerabilities. Putin's nationalist sentiments unite Russia behind the notion of a resurgent country, and he sets a historical context for his geopolitical grievances and perceived Western aggression. Putin's complex identity reflects his determination to restore Russia's position as a great power. Putin's response to mass protests. In response to the mass protests in Moscow in 2011 and 2012, Putin utilized both his case officer and history man personas. The protesters were mostly members of Russia's affluent, creative class, who desired democratic change. Putin quelled the demonstrations by employing the case officer to infiltrate and suppress dissident voices, while using his history man guise to secure a re-election victory through a populist message of national unity. Putin believed that the United States and Europe were behind the opposition movement and accused Western governments of paying protesters and influencing civil society through Western NGOs and information networks. Putin's perspective on the West. Putin's growing conviction that the West is hostile towards Russia was fostered by a series of US and European aggressive actions throughout his presidency. Putin saw NATO's expansion up to the Russian border, the US invasion of Iraq, and the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine as the West's attempts to establish pro-Western governments in countries with strong Russian ties. He concluded that the US was hostile to Russia's interests and decided to defend his nation against perceived Western aggression. Putin and his advisors believed that Russia needed to come to terms with the reality that the West was engaging in a new kind of warfare that utilized non-military tactics to achieve geostrategic objectives. Consequently, Putin set out to develop the capabilities to fight effectively against this new form of warfare by utilizing all the levers of state power, including informational, political, economic, and humanitarian tools. All of Russia's actions in Ukraine in 2014 were, according to Putin, linked to the development and deployment of new warfare weapons. Putin's Ukraine strategy. Putin used Ukraine as a testing ground for his approach to modern warfare against Western aggression. He believed that Ukraine's tilt towards the European Union and the resulting protests were direct results of Western interference and a threat to Russia's sovereignty. Viewing Russians and Ukrainians as united, Putin believed that the annexation of Crimea was a legitimate act of self-defense against Western meddling. Ukraine was seen as the birthplace of the Russian state, and correcting the historical error of the artificial border was a priority. Putin's strategy aimed to send a message to the United States that future actions would come at a cost. The interests of wealthy oligarchs linked personally to Putin were intertwined with the Russian state, creating a corporate empire in Russia. Putin's appreciation of using history as a policy tool shaped his approach to Ukraine, and the effects of his actions continue to have global implications. Putin's view on West-US relations. Putin is willing to cooperate with the US and its allies in areas of mutual strategic interest, such as Iran, Syria, and combating Islamic militants. However, he holds a dark view of the West and seeks to establish respected, autonomous spheres of influence in a New Yalta. Until then, Putin sees the US and its allies as a threat to Russian interests and will continue to confront them.
Having unraveled the intricacies of Putin's mind and understanding his governing style, we learn how he has shaped modern-day Russia and impacted geopolitics. Putin's 6 identities have allowed him to take a multifaceted approach to governing, from rebuilding Russia's state power and defending its interests to manipulating its rich history to sustain his political agenda. His KGB background has proven invaluable in both internal and international affairs, exposing the darker aspects of his leadership. This comprehensive summary helps to understand the enigmatic Putin, providing insight into his motivations, the world he lives in and how he interacts with it, and sheds light on Russia's direction as a global force under his rule.